Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime storytelling channel for sleeping. Let's get into our first story. Story 1, The Backpacker Murderer, The Deadly Hunt of ElevenLabs. The Belanglo State Forest stretched across thousands of acres of dense Australian bushland, its towering eucalyptus trees and thick undergrowth creating a maze of shadows and silence that had remained largely undisturbed for decades. Located southwest of Sydney, this remote wilderness had long been a destination for campers, hikers, and nature enthusiasts seeking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But in the early 1990s, Belanglo would become synonymous with terror as the discovery of human remains buried beneath its canopy would expose one of Australia's most horrific serial killing sprees. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December 27, 1944, in Guildford, a working-class suburb of Sydney, into a family that would become notorious for dysfunction and violence. The fifth of 14 children born to Croatian immigrant Stepan Milat and Australian-born Margaret Piddleston, Ivan grew up in a household where aggression was commonplace and criminal behavior was often overlooked or even encouraged. His father Stepan was a violent man who ruled the family through fear and intimidation, while his mother Margaret struggled to maintain control over her large brood of increasingly troubled children. The Milat family home was a place of chaos and neglect, where children were left to fend for themselves, and violence was an accepted method of resolving disputes. Ivan's older brothers had already established patterns of criminal behavior by the time he reached adolescence, with several serving time in prison for various offenses including theft, assault, and armed robbery. This environment normalized criminal activity for young Ivan, who saw law-breaking not as aberrant behavior but as a natural way of life. From an early age, Ivan displayed troubling behavioral patterns that would later escalate into deadly violence. He was known for his explosive temper, his tendency to hold grudges, and his fascination with weapons and hunting. Unlike his brothers, who were often loud and boisterous in their criminal activities, Ivan was quieter and more calculating, preferring to observe and plan rather than act impulsively. This methodical approach would later make him particularly dangerous as a serial killer, as he learned to avoid detection through careful planning and execution. Ivan's first serious encounter with the law came in 1971, when he was arrested for the rape of two female hitchhikers near Liverpool, south of Sydney. The attack demonstrated many of the characteristics that would later define his murder spree, including his targeting of vulnerable travelers, his use of remote locations, and his willingness to employ extreme violence to control his victims. However, the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, allowing Ivan to escape punishment and continue developing his predatory skills. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Ivan worked various jobs in construction and road maintenance, occupations that gave him extensive knowledge of remote areas throughout New South Wales. His work often took him to isolated locations where he could operate without fear of discovery, and he used these opportunities to scout potential dumping grounds for future crimes. Colleagues would later describe him as a competent worker who kept to himself, displaying little emotion and rarely participating in social activities with his coworkers. During this period, Ivan also developed his skills as a hunter and outdoorsman, spending countless hours in the Australian bush learning to track animals, navigate difficult terrain, and survive in harsh conditions. He became an expert marksman with both rifles and handguns, and he accumulated an extensive collection of weapons that he stored at various locations throughout the region. This knowledge of the wilderness and proficiency with firearms would prove crucial to his later success as a serial killer, allowing him to control victims and dispose of bodies in locations where they would remain undiscovered for years. The first confirmed victim of Ivan Milat was Carolyn Clark, a 21-year-old British backpacker who had been traveling through Australia with her friend Joanne Walters. The two young women had been exploring the country during a gap year before university, documenting their adventures in letters home to families who eagerly awaited news of their travels. On April 18, 1992, Caroline and Joanne were last seen attempting to hitchhike from King's Cross in Sydney to a fruit-picking job in Albury, a common route for budget-conscious travelers seeking work to fund their continued adventures. Ivan encountered the two women at a highway rest stop where many backpackers gathered to find rides to various destinations throughout Australia. Presenting himself as a friendly local who was familiar with the area, he offered to drive them partway to their destination, claiming he was heading in the same direction on business. Caroline and Joanne, like many young travelers, were trusting and eager to accept help from locals who seemed knowledgeable about the best routes and safest travel methods. What happened next would not be discovered until September 19, 1992, when orienteers training in Belanglo State Forest stumbled upon human remains that had been partially buried beneath fallen logs and forest debris. The discovery of Caroline Clark's body, followed shortly by the remains of Joanne Walters, marked the beginning of one of Australia's most intensive criminal investigations. Both women had been subjected to horrific violence before their deaths, with evidence suggesting they had been held captive and tortured over an extended period. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through Australia's backpacker community and the families of the victims, who had spent months desperately searching for any information about their missing daughters. The remote location of the burial site and the sophisticated attempts to conceal the remains suggested that the killer was intimately familiar with the forest and had access to tools and equipment needed to transport and bury the bodies. Police immediately recognized that they were dealing with a highly organized and dangerous predator who posed a significant threat to other travelers. The investigation that followed was complicated by the vast size of Belanglo State Forest and the limited physical evidence available at the crime scenes. The harsh Australian climate and the activities of scavenging animals had destroyed much of the forensic evidence that might have provided immediate leads to the killer's identity. However, investigators were able to determine that both women had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, and the precision of the wounds suggested that the killer was an experienced marksman familiar with firearms. As news of the murders spread throughout the international backpacker community, other families began to come forward with reports of missing relatives who had last been seen in the Sydney area. James Gibson and Deborah Everest, a young Australian couple from Victoria, had disappeared in December 1989 while hitchhiking from Melbourne to Sydney. Simone Schmidl, a 20-year-old German backpacker, had vanished in January 1991 while traveling from Sydney to Melbourne. Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschid, both German tourists, had disappeared in December 1991 while hitchhiking from Sydney to Adelaide. The pattern that emerged from these disappearances was disturbing in its consistency. All of the missing persons were young people traveling on limited budgets who had been hitchhiking along major highways in New South Wales. All had last been seen in areas where ElevenLabs was known to frequent, either for work or personal reasons. The similarities in the victims' profiles and travel routes suggested that a single predator was systematically targeting backpackers, using their vulnerability and isolation against them. On October 5, 1993, the body of Simone Schmidl was discovered in Belanglo State Forest, approximately 1 kilometer from where Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters had been found. The discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears that they were dealing with a serial killer who was using the remote forest as his personal killing ground. Simone's remains showed evidence of extreme violence, including multiple stab wounds and signs that she had been subjected to prolonged torture before her death. The discovery of Simone's body intensified the police investigation and led to the formation of Task Force Air, a specialized unit dedicated to solving the backpacker murders. The task force brought together investigators from multiple jurisdictions and disciplines, including homicide detectives, forensic specialists, and behavioral analysts who worked to develop a profile of the unknown killer. The investigation expanded to examine hundreds of missing person reports and suspicious incidents involving travelers throughout Australia. On November 1, 1993, the bodies of James Gibson and Deborah Everest were located in Belanglo State Forest, bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 5. The young couple had been murdered execution style, with both victims showing evidence of having been restrained and tortured before being shot. The discovery of their remains provided additional forensic evidence that would later prove crucial in identifying and prosecuting their killer, including ballistics evidence that linked their deaths to the other murders. The final 2 victims, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschid, were discovered on November 4, 1993, completing the gruesome tally of 7 confirmed murder victims. The German couple had been subjected to particularly brutal violence, with evidence suggesting that they had been held captive for an extended period before being killed. The systematic nature of the torture and the organized disposal of the bodies demonstrated that the killer was not acting impulsively, but was carrying out a carefully planned campaign of violence against innocent travelers. The discovery of all 7 bodies within a relatively small area of Belanglo State Forest provided investigators with a concentrated crime scene that yielded significant forensic evidence. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the same .22 caliber rifle had been used in multiple murders, while other physical evidence suggested that the killer had used specific tools and equipment to restrain and torture his victims. The remote location and the sophisticated burial methods indicated that the perpetrator was extremely familiar with the forest and had likely used it as a killing ground for an extended period. As the investigation progressed, police began to develop a profile of the likely suspect based on the evidence gathered from the crime scenes and the patterns observed in the murders. The killer was almost certainly a local resident with extensive knowledge of the Belanglo area, someone who was comfortable operating in the wilderness and had access to firearms and other weapons. The organized nature of the crime suggested that the perpetrator was methodical and patient, capable of planning complex operations and avoiding detection over an extended period. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony that gradually pointed investigators toward Ivan Milat. Paul Onions, a British backpacker who had managed to escape from Ivan's vehicle in January 1990, provided crucial testimony about his terrifying encounter with a man who matched Ivan's description. Onions had been hitchhiking south of Sydney when he was picked up by a driver who initially seemed friendly and helpful, but quickly became threatening and aggressive. According to Onions' account, the driver had produced a gun and attempted to restrain him, but Onions had managed to escape from the moving vehicle and flagged down help from passing motorists. At the time, Onions had reported the incident to local police, but it had not been connected to the backpacker murders until investigators began reviewing old reports for any incidents involving threatening behavior toward hitchhikers. Onion's detailed description of his attacker and the vehicle he was driving provided investigators with their first solid lead in the case. The investigation into Ivan Milat intensified when ballistics tests conducted on weapons seized from the Milat family property matched bullets recovered from the victims' bodies. The .22 caliber rifle used in the murders was found among Ivan's extensive collection of firearms, providing the physical evidence needed to link him directly to the crimes. Additional searches of the property revealed camping and hunting equipment that matched items found at the burial sites, further strengthening the case against him. On May 22, 1994, Ivan Milat was arrested at his home in Eagle Vale, a suburb southwest of Sydney, and charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers found in Belanglo State Forest. The arrest came after months of intensive surveillance and investigation that had gradually built an overwhelming case against him. When police searched his property, they discovered an arsenal of weapons, camping equipment, and personal items belonging to several of the victims, providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Ivan's reaction to his arrest was consistent with his personality throughout his criminal career. He maintained his innocence and showed no emotion or remorse when confronted with the evidence against him. His calm demeanor and apparent lack of concern about the charges surprised many observers, who expected to see some reaction to being accused of such horrific crimes. This emotional detachment would continue throughout his trial and imprisonment, reinforcing the assessment that he was a psychopath incapable of empathy or remorse. The trial of Ivan Milat began on March 26, 1996, and became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Australian history. The prosecution presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial connections that painted a picture of Ivan as a calculating predator who had systematically hunted and killed innocent travelers. The defense attempted to challenge the forensic evidence and suggest that Ivan had been framed by other family members, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence made their task nearly impossible. During the trial, the full extent of Ivan's brutality became clear as forensic experts testified about the torture and violence inflicted on the victims before their deaths. The evidence showed that Ivan had not simply killed his victims quickly, but had prolonged their suffering through systematic torture that demonstrated a sadistic enjoyment of their pain. The victims had been stabbed, shot, and beaten, with some showing evidence of sexual assault and other forms of degradation. Paul Onion's testimony was particularly compelling as he provided the court with a first-hand account of Ivan's methods and personality. Onions described how Ivan had initially seemed like a helpful local offering assistance to a stranded traveler, but had quickly revealed his true nature when he produced weapons and attempted to restrain his intended victim. The testimony provided crucial insight into Ivan's modus operandi and helped explain how he had been able to gain the trust of his victims before attacking them. The prosecution also presented evidence of Ivan's extensive knowledge of the Belanglo area and his history of violent behavior toward women. Witnesses testified about previous incidents in which Ivan had threatened or attacked female hitchhikers, establishing a pattern of predatory behavior that had escalated to murder. The methodical nature of the crimes and the sophisticated disposal of the bodies demonstrated that Ivan had been perfecting his techniques over many years. On July 27, 1996, after a trial lasting more than 4 months, Ivan Milat was found guilty on all 7 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with relief from the victims' families and the broader Australian community, who had followed the case closely and demanded justice for the innocent young people whose lives had been cut short by Ivan's violence. The judge who presided over the case described the murders as among the most heinous crimes in Australian criminal history. The conviction of Ivan Milat provided closure for the families of the confirmed victims, but it also raised disturbing questions about the possibility of additional murders that had not yet been discovered. Investigators believe that Ivan may have been killing for much longer than the confirmed time frame, and that other victims' remains might still be buried in remote locations throughout New South Wales. The systematic nature of his crimes and his extensive knowledge of wilderness areas suggested that the 7 confirmed murders might represent only a fraction of his actual victim count. Following his conviction, Ivan was transferred to Goulburn Correctional Center, a maximum security prison where he would spend the remainder of his life. His behavior in prison was consistent with his previous pattern of violence and defiance, as he repeatedly clashed with guards and other inmates, while maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He made several escape attempts and was involved in numerous disciplinary incidents that resulted in extended periods of solitary confinement. In 2001, Ivan began a hunger strike that lasted more than a month, apparently in protest of his treatment by prison authorities and his continued incarceration. The hunger strike attracted significant media attention and raised questions about his mental state, but Ivan eventually ended the protest without achieving any of his stated goals. His willingness to risk his own life rather than accept responsibility for his crimes demonstrated the depth of his narcissism and his refusal to acknowledge the harm he had caused. The impact of Ivan Milat's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect the entire culture of backpacker travel in Australia. The murders created a climate of fear and suspicion that fundamentally changed how young travelers approached hitchhiking and budget travel throughout the country. Many backpackers began traveling in larger groups or avoiding hitchhiking altogether, while tourism authorities implemented new safety programs designed to educate travelers about potential dangers. The international media coverage of the case also damaged Australia's reputation as a safe destination for budget travelers, leading to decreased tourism revenue and forcing the government to invest in extensive marketing campaigns to restore confidence in the country's safety. The murders became a defining moment in Australian criminal history, representing a dark chapter that challenged the nation's self-image as a welcoming and safe destination for international visitors. The investigation into Ivan's crimes also revealed significant problems with information sharing between police jurisdictions and the tracking of missing persons cases. The fact that 7 people had been murdered over a period of several years before a coordinated investigation was launched highlighted weaknesses in the system that potentially allowed Ivan to continue killing undetected. These revelations led to reforms in police procedures and the establishment of better protocols for investigating missing persons cases involving travelers. The families of Ivan's victims became powerful advocates for improved safety measures and better support for the families of crime victims. They worked tirelessly to ensure that their loved ones were remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and bright futures that had been cut short by senseless violence. Their advocacy efforts led to the establishment of victim support services and memorials that continue to honor the memory of those who were lost. The case also provided valuable insights into the psychology of serial killers and the methods they use to select and control their victims. Ivan's systematic targeting of backpackers demonstrated how predators could exploit the vulnerability of travelers who were far from home and unfamiliar with local dangers. His ability to appear helpful and trustworthy while concealing his deadly intentions showed how effective manipulative techniques could be in gaining access to potential victims. Mental health professionals who studied Ivan's case identified characteristics consistent with psychopathy, including lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, and complete absence of remorse for his actions. His ability to maintain relationships with family members while simultaneously hunting and killing strangers demonstrated the compartmentalized thinking common among serial killers. The systematic nature of his crimes and his sophisticated methods of avoiding detection indicated high intelligence combined with complete moral bankruptcy. The forensic techniques used to investigate Ivan's crimes were groundbreaking for their time and helped establish new standards for processing complex crime scenes in remote locations. The careful excavation and analysis of the burial sites in Balanglo State Forest provided crucial evidence that would not have been available with less sophisticated investigative methods. The integration of ballistics analysis, forensic anthropology, and behavioral profiling created a comprehensive approach to serial killer investigations that became a model for future cases. The media coverage of the Ivan Milat case was extensive and sometimes controversial, as news outlets struggled to balance public interest with respect for the victims and their families. The sensational nature of the crimes and the remote forest setting captured public imagination, leading to numerous books, documentaries, and films exploring the case. However, this attention sometimes overshadowed the victims themselves, turning their deaths into entertainment rather than tragedies deserving of respect and remembrance. Ivan's family members also became subjects of intense scrutiny and suspicion, as investigators explored the possibility that other Milat family members might have been involved in the murders or other violent crimes. Several of Ivan's brothers had extensive criminal records, and the family's history of violence and dysfunction suggested that Ivan's behavior might not have been entirely aberrant within that context. However, despite extensive investigation, no evidence was found to support charges against other family members in connection with the backpacker murders. The long-term impact of Ivan's crimes on Australian society included changes to hitchhiking culture, improvements in missing persons investigation procedures, and increased awareness of the vulnerability of international travelers. The case became a watershed moment that forced Australians to confront the reality that their country was not immune to the kind of random violence that had previously been associated with other nations. This recognition led to important conversations about safety, security, and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable visitors. The scientific and investigative techniques developed during the Ivan Milat investigation continue to influence modern criminal investigations, particularly in cases involving multiple victims and remote crime scenes. The systematic approach to excavating and analyzing the Balanglo burial sites established protocols that have been used in numerous subsequent cases, while the behavioral profiling techniques employed to identify Ivan as a suspect have been refined and applied to other serial killer investigations around the world. Educational institutions began incorporating the Ivan Milat case into criminology and forensic science curricula, using it as a comprehensive example of how modern investigative techniques could be applied to solve complex criminal cases. The case demonstrated the importance of coordinating multiple disciplines and jurisdictions in major investigations, while also highlighting the crucial role that witnesses and survivors could play in identifying and prosecuting dangerous criminals. The victims of Ivan Milat were young people at the beginning of their adult lives, exploring the world and seeking adventure in a country that had promised them safety and welcome. Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters were best friends embarking on what should have been the adventure of a lifetime. James Gibson and Deborah Everest were a young couple planning their future together. Simone Schmidl was an independent traveler seeking to broaden her horizons through international experience. Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschid were exploring Australia as part of their journey toward building careers in their home country. Each of these individuals represented not just a life lost, but potential unrealized, dreams unfulfilled, and families forever changed by sudden and senseless tragedy. Their deaths served as a stark reminder that evil could strike anywhere, even in places that seemed safe and welcoming. The randomness of their selection as victims emphasized the vulnerability that all travelers face when they venture far from home and familiar surroundings. The investigation and prosecution of Ivan Milat consumed enormous resources and required unprecedented cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies, government departments, and international organizations. The cost of the investigation, trial, and ongoing incarceration was substantial, but the investment was considered essential to ensure that justice was served and that a dangerous predator was permanently removed from society. The case demonstrated that solving complex serial murder cases required sustained commitment and significant resources over extended periods. The technological limitations of the early 1990s meant that many investigative techniques that would be routine today were not available to the original investigators. DNA analysis was in its infancy, digital forensics did not exist, and communication between agencies was much more difficult than it would be today. Despite these limitations, investigators were able to build a compelling case through careful attention to detail, systematic collection and analysis of evidence, and persistent follow-up on even minor leads. The international dimensions of the case required cooperation with law enforcement agencies, diplomatic missions, and family members in multiple countries, creating complex logistical and legal challenges that had to be overcome to ensure a successful prosecution. The fact that most of the victims were foreign nationals added layers of complexity to the investigation and required sensitivity to different cultural expectations about how such cases should be handled. Prison officials who dealt with Ivan during his incarceration described him as manipulative, violent, and completely unrepentant about his crimes. He continued to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, and he showed no interest in providing information that might help locate additional victims or provide closure for other families. His behavior in prison included multiple escape attempts, attacks on guards and other inmates, and persistent efforts to manipulate the media and public opinion in his favor. Mental health professionals who evaluated Ivan found him to be highly intelligent, but completely lacking in empathy or remorse for his actions. He demonstrated classic characteristics of psychopathy, including superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, and complete inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. His crimes were not driven by passion or temporary mental illness, but by a calculated desire to inflict suffering on vulnerable victims who could not defend themselves. The legacy of Ivan Milat's crimes continues to influence Australian society and law enforcement practices more than 2 decades after his conviction. The case established precedents for investigating serial murders, processing complex crime scenes, and coordinating multi-jurisdictional investigations that continue to guide modern police work. The victims are remembered through memorials and educational programs that ensure their deaths were not in vain, but contributed to improved safety for future travelers. Ivan Milat died in prison on October 27, 2019, at the age of 74, having served more than 20 years of his life sentence. His death was met with relief from the victims' families and law enforcement officials who had dealt with his continued attempts to manipulate the system and avoid responsibility for his crimes. He took with him any secrets about additional victims or crimes that might have provided closure for other families, leaving questions that will never be answered about the full extent of his murderous career. The story of Ivan Milat and his reign of terror in Belanglo State Forest remains one of Australia's most notorious criminal cases, a dark chapter that exposed the vulnerability of young travelers and the evil that could lurk in the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places. His systematic hunting and killing of innocent backpackers shattered the innocence of a generation of travelers and forced a nation to confront the reality that monsters could exist anywhere, even in their own backyard. The victims of the backpacker murderer are remembered not as statistics in a criminal case, but as vibrant young people whose lives were cut short by unimaginable evil, their memories serving as a lasting reminder of the importance of vigilance, justice, and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Story 2. Hash the Monster Killer, the Rampage of Yang Xinhai. In the rural provinces of northern China, where ancient villages dot the landscape between sprawling industrial cities and vast agricultural plains, the early years of the 21st century brought terror unlike anything the region had ever experienced. Between 2000 and 2003, a shadow moved through the night across Henan, Hebei, Shandong, and Anhui provinces, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable brutality that would shake the foundations of Chinese society and expose the vulnerabilities of a nation in rapid transition. The perpetrator of these horrors would become known as Yang Xinhai, though the media would christen him with a name that captured the essence of his evil, the monster killer. Yang Xinhai was born in 1968 in a small farming village in Henan province, the heart of China's agricultural belt, where generations of families had worked the same soil and lived according to traditions that stretch back thousands of years. His early life was marked by poverty, dysfunction, and the grinding hardships that characterized rural China during the tumultuous decades of economic transformation that followed the Cultural Revolution. The youngest of several children in a family struggling to survive on subsistence farming, Yang grew up in an environment where violence was commonplace and human life held little apparent value. His childhood was shaped by the brutal realities of rural Chinese life in the 1970s and 1980s, when political upheaval, economic uncertainty, and social dislocation created conditions of extreme stress for millions of families. Yang's father was an alcoholic who frequently beat his wife and children, while his mother struggled with mental illness that went untreated due to the lack of medical resources in their remote village. The combination of poverty, domestic violence, and untreated mental illness created a toxic environment that would profoundly influence Yang's psychological development. From an early age, Yang displayed behavioral problems that set him apart from other children in his village. He was cruel to animals, showing no empathy when he tortured and killed cats, dogs, and farm animals for his own amusement. Teachers at the local school reported that he was aggressive toward other students, frequently getting into fights and showing no remorse when disciplined. His academic performance was poor, not due to lack of intelligence, but because of his inability to focus on anything that did not involve violence or domination over others. As Yang entered adolescence, his behavioral problems intensified and began to take on more serious criminal dimensions. He was caught stealing from neighbors, vandalizing property, and threatening younger children with violence. His parents, overwhelmed by their own problems and lacking the resources to address their son's increasingly disturbing behavior, largely ignored these warning signs. The village community, bound by traditional concepts of family shame and face-saving, was reluctant to intervene in what was seen as a private family matter. Yang's first serious encounter with the law came in 1988, when he was arrested for attempted rape. The victim was a young woman from a neighboring village who had been walking alone at night when Yang attacked her. She managed to escape and report the assault to local authorities, leading to Yang's arrest and conviction. However, the Chinese criminal justice system of the late 1980s was ill-equipped to deal with violent offenders, and Yang received a relatively light sentence that failed to address the underlying psychological issues driving his criminal behavior. During his imprisonment, Yang's resentment toward society deepened, and he began to develop the twisted ideology that would later drive his killing spree. He blamed others for his problems, refusing to accept responsibility for his actions, and instead viewing himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Fellow inmates later reported that Yang spent his time fantasizing about revenge against the society that had rejected him, developing elaborate plans for future crimes that would dwarf his previous offenses. Upon his release from prison in 1996, Yang found himself unable to readjust to normal life. The rapid economic changes that had transformed China during his incarceration had left traditional rural communities struggling to adapt, and opportunities for someone with Yang's background and criminal record were virtually non-existent. He drifted from job to job, never able to maintain steady employment or form meaningful relationships with others. His isolation and frustration continued to build, creating the psychological pressure that would eventually explode into unprecedented violence. Yang's descent into serial murder began gradually, with his first confirmed killing occurring in May 2000 in a small village in Henan province. The victim was an elderly farmer named Liu Wei, who lived alone in a traditional courtyard house on the outskirts of the village. Yang had been wandering the countryside for weeks, observing potential targets and planning his approach. He chose Liu Wei because the old man lived in isolation and was unlikely to be discovered for several days after his death. Yang broke into Liu Wei's home in the early hours of the morning, when the elderly farmer was asleep and defenseless. Using a hammer he had stolen from a construction site, Yang bludgeoned Liu Wei to death in his bed, then ransacked the house looking for money and valuables. The brutality of the attack went far beyond what was necessary to kill the victim, suggesting that Yang derived psychological satisfaction from inflicting pain and terror. When Lu Wei's body was discovered 3 days later by a concerned neighbor, the savage nature of the crime shocked the local community and sparked fears that a dangerous criminal was operating in the area. The murder of Liu Wei established the pattern that Yang would follow for the next 3 years. He targeted isolated rural homes where victims would be vulnerable and discovery would be delayed, allowing him time to escape before authorities could respond. His weapons of choice were hammers, axes, and knives, tools that were readily available and allowed him to inflict maximum damage on his victims. The extreme violence he employed went far beyond what was necessary for robbery, indicating that killing had become an end in itself rather than merely a means to obtain money or goods. Yang's second confirmed murder occurred in August 2000 when he killed a family of 4 in Shandong province. The Chen family, consisting of parents in their 40s and 2 teenage children, lived in a modest farmhouse several kilometers from the nearest neighbor. Yang had been observing the family for several days, learning their routines and waiting for the optimal time to strike. He chose a night when the father was away on business, leaving the mother and children alone and vulnerable. Yang broke into the Chen home around 2 a.m., first killing the mother with repeated hammer blows to the head before turning his attention to the 2 children, aged 14 and 16. The teenagers awoke to find their mother dead and Yang standing over them with blood-covered weapons. But their screams were cut short by his savage attack. When the father returned home 2 days later, he discovered the mutilated bodies of his family arranged in grotesque positions that suggested Yang had spent considerable time at the scene after the murders. The Chen family murders marked a significant escalation in Yang's violence, both in terms of the number of victims and the level of brutality employed. Crime scene investigators noted that Yang had inflicted far more wounds than necessary to kill his victims, suggesting that he was deriving psychological pleasure from the act of killing itself. The arrangement of the bodies also indicated a level of psychological disturbance that went beyond simple criminal behavior, pointing toward the actions of a deeply disturbed individual who was completely detached from normal human empathy. As news of the murders spread through the rural communities of northern China, fear began to grip villages throughout the region. The randomness of Yang's target selection meant that any isolated family could become his next victim, creating a climate of terror that fundamentally changed how people lived their daily lives. Families who had never locked their doors began installing multiple security measures, while many chose to stay with relatives in more populated areas rather than risk being alone at night. Yang's third major attack occurred in November 2000, when he murdered 5 members of the Wang family in Anhui province. The victims included 3 generations, grandparents, parents, and a young child, who lived together in a traditional extended family arrangement common in rural China. Yang had been stalking the family for over a week, learning their routines and waiting for an opportunity when all family members would be present and vulnerable. The Wang family murders demonstrated Yang's evolving methodology and his increasing comfort with large-scale violence. He entered the home through an unlocked window around midnight, first killing the elderly grandparents in their sleep before moving through the house to eliminate the other family members. The parents attempted to defend their child, but Yang's superior strength and weapons made resistance futile. When their bodies were discovered the next morning by a postal worker making deliveries, the scene was so horrific that several police officers required psychological counseling. The investigation into the Wang family murders revealed evidence that Yang had spent considerable time at the crime scene after completing his kills. He had eaten food from the family's kitchen, rested in their chairs, and appeared to have searched thoroughly through their belongings. This behavior suggested that Yang was becoming increasingly confident in his ability to avoid detection, allowing him to take unnecessary risks that satisfied his psychological needs, rather than focusing solely on escape. Throughout 2001, Yang's killing spree continued to escalate in both frequency and brutality. He murdered at least 15 people during this period, striking in villages across 4 different provinces and always managing to escape before authorities could respond effectively. His targets continued to be isolated rural families, chosen for their vulnerability rather than any personal connection to Yang. The randomness of his victim selection made it nearly impossible for police to predict where he would strike next, allowing him to stay ahead of the manhunt that was beginning to intensify. The murder of the Zhang family in February 2001 represented one of Yang's most brutal attacks. The family of 6, including 4 children ranging in age from 5 to 15, lived in a remote farmhouse in Hebei province. Yang broke into their home during a winter storm that masked the sounds of his entry and provided cover for his escape. He systematically murdered each family member, starting with the parents and then moving to the children, who had awakened and were attempting to hide from the intruder. The Zhang family crime scene provided investigators with their first significant forensic evidence linking the murders to a single perpetrator. Yang had cut himself during the attack, leaving blood traces that would later be used for DNA analysis. He had also left footprints in the mud outside the house, providing information about his approximate height and weight. However, the forensic capabilities of rural Chinese police departments in 2001 were limited, and it would be months before this evidence could be properly analyzed and connected to other crime scenes. Yang's psychological state during this period was deteriorating rapidly, as evidenced by the increasing savagery of his attacks and his willingness to take greater risks. He began targeting families during earlier hours of the evening, when the chances of discovery were higher. He also started leaving more obvious evidence at crime scenes, suggesting that his need for psychological satisfaction was overriding his survival instincts. Mental health experts who later studied the case concluded that Yang was experiencing a complete breakdown of impulse control that made his eventual capture inevitable. The summer of 2001 saw Yang's most prolific period of killing, with at least 8 families murdered between June and September. The pace of the murders indicated that Yang was no longer able to control his urges, killing whenever the opportunity presented itself, rather than following the careful planning that had characterized his earlier crimes. This acceleration in violence created additional problems for investigators, who found themselves overwhelmed by the number of crime scenes and the limited resources available for forensic analysis. The murder of the Li family in August 2001 marked a turning point in the investigation, as it was the first crime scene where Yang encountered unexpected resistance. The family's teenage son, Li Ming, was a martial arts student who had been training since childhood. When Yang broke into the house and began attacking his parents, Li Ming fought back with considerable skill, managing to wound Yang with a kitchen knife before ultimately succumbing to the intruder's superior weapons and size. The resistance offered by Li Ming provided investigators with crucial evidence about Yang's physical characteristics and fighting style. The teenager had managed to scratch Yang's face and arms, leaving skin and blood under his fingernails that would later provide DNA evidence. Li Ming had also torn Yang's clothing, leaving fabric samples at the scene that would help identify the killer when he was eventually captured. Most importantly, Li Ming's father had managed to wound Yang in the leg before dying, causing an injury that would limit Yang's mobility for several weeks. The physical evidence gathered from the Li family crime scene allowed investigators to begin developing a more detailed profile of their suspect. They determined that Yang was approximately 5'8" inches tall, weighed around 160 pounds, and had distinctive scars on his face and arms from his encounter with Li Ming. The DNA evidence also confirmed that all of the murders were being committed by the same individual, allowing police to coordinate their investigation across multiple provinces for the first time. As autumn arrived in 2001, Yang's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The injury he had sustained during the Li family murders had become infected, causing him significant pain and limiting his ability to travel long distances. He began targeting victims closer to populated areas, taking greater risks in exchange for easier access to medical supplies and food. This change in behavior would ultimately lead to his downfall, as increased police patrols in populated areas made it more likely that he would be spotted and identified. The murder of the Guo family in October 2001 provided the breakthrough that investigators had been seeking. The family lived on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in Henan province, close enough to populated areas that their screams were heard by neighbors, who immediately called police. When officers arrived at the scene within minutes of receiving the emergency call, they found Yang still inside the house, standing over the bodies of his latest victims with blood-covered weapons in his hands. Yang's capture was anticlimactic compared to the years of terror he had inflicted on rural communities throughout northern China. He offered no resistance when confronted by armed police officers, instead dropping his weapons and surrendering, without attempting to flee or fight. His calm demeanor in the face of arrest shocked the officers who had been hunting him for months, as he showed no emotion or remorse about being caught or about the crimes he had committed. During his initial interrogation, Yang confessed to the murders with a matter-of-fact attitude that disturbed even experienced homicide investigators. He provided detailed descriptions of his crimes, showing complete recall of the violence he had inflicted on his victims. However, he demonstrated no understanding of why his actions were wrong, instead expressing frustration that society had failed to provide him with the opportunities he believed he deserved. His complete lack of empathy for his victims confirmed investigators' assessment that they were dealing with a psychopath of extraordinary dangerousness. The investigation that followed Yang's arrest revealed the true scope of his crimes, which far exceeded what authorities had initially suspected. Through his confessions and forensic evidence, investigators were able to link Yang to at least 67 murders and 23 rapes committed across 4 provinces over a period of 3.5 years. The victims ranged in age from infants to elderly grandparents, with entire families being wiped out in single attacks that demonstrated Yang's complete disregard for human life. The forensic evidence collected from crime scenes throughout Yang's killing spree provided unprecedented insights into the methods and psychology of a serial killer operating in rural China. DNA analysis confirmed Yang's presence at dozens of crime scenes, while ballistics evidence linked him to murders committed with stolen firearms. The systematic nature of his attacks and his ability to avoid detection for years demonstrated a level of planning and intelligence that contradicted the image of an impulsive killer driven solely by rage. Yang's trial began in early 2003 and attracted massive media attention throughout China and internationally. The case represented one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in modern Chinese history, and the brutality of Yang's crimes shocked a society that had believed itself largely immune to such extreme violence. The proceedings were closely monitored by government officials concerned about the potential impact on social stability and China's international reputation. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Yang's guilt, including DNA evidence, witness testimony, and Yang's own detailed confessions. The defense attempted to argue that Yang was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. But psychiatric evaluations concluded that while Yang was clearly psychopathic, he understood the nature of his crimes and the difference between right and wrong. The court rejected the insanity defense and found Yang guilty on all charges. The testimony of survivors and family members of victims provided harrowing accounts of the impact Yang's crimes had on rural communities throughout northern China. Many families had been forced to abandon their ancestral homes and move to urban areas where they felt safer, disrupting traditional ways of life that had persisted for generations. The psychological trauma inflicted on entire communities would take years to heal, with many residents reporting ongoing anxiety and depression related to the terror Yang had inflicted. Mental health experts who evaluated Yang during his trial identified classic characteristics of psychopathy, including complete lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, and inability to form genuine emotional connections with others. His crimes were not driven by passion or temporary mental illness, but by a calculated desire to inflict suffering on vulnerable victims who represented the society that had rejected him. The systematic nature of his violence and his ability to maintain normal interactions with people when not actively killing demonstrated the sophisticated psychological manipulation typical of successful serial killers. On February 14, 2004, Yang Xinhai was executed by lethal injection at a prison in Henan province, bringing to an end one of the most horrific crime sprees in Chinese history. His execution was carried out with minimal publicity, as Chinese authorities sought to avoid creating a cult of personality around Yang that might inspire copycat crimes. The speed of his execution, less than a year after his conviction, reflected the severity of his crimes and the government's determination to demonstrate that such violence would not be tolerated. The case of Yang Xinhai exposed significant weaknesses in China's rural law enforcement capabilities and highlighted the challenges faced by a rapidly modernizing society in maintaining public safety. The fact that Yang had been able to operate undetected for over 3 years while committing dozens of murders demonstrated the need for better coordination between provincial police forces and improved forensic capabilities in rural areas. The case became a catalyst for significant reforms in Chinese law enforcement, including increased funding for rural police departments and enhanced training in criminal investigation techniques. The investigation into Yang's crimes also revealed the vulnerability of China's rural population during a period of rapid social and economic change. The traditional community structures that had provided security for generations were breaking down as young people migrated to cities for work, leaving elderly parents and children vulnerable to predators like Yang. The isolation of rural communities, which had once been a source of security, became a liability in an era when criminals could travel quickly between provinces using modern transportation networks. The psychological impact of Yang's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect millions of people throughout rural China who suddenly realized that their traditional way of life offered little protection against modern predators. Many families invested in security systems, guard dogs, and other protective measures that had previously been considered unnecessary in close-knit rural communities. The social fabric of rural China was fundamentally altered by the recognition that evil could strike anywhere, at any time without warning or apparent motive. The international media coverage of Yang's case brought unwanted attention to China's criminal justice system and raised questions about the country's ability to maintain public safety during its period of rapid development. The fact that such extensive murders had occurred without attracting international attention until Yang's capture highlighted the challenges of monitoring and reporting crime in a country undergoing massive social transformation. Chinese authorities worked to minimize international coverage of the case while using it domestically as an example of their commitment to public safety. Educational institutions began incorporating the Yang Xinhai case into criminology and psychology curricula, using it as an example of how social dislocation and economic change could contribute to the development of extreme criminal behavior. The case demonstrated the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood behavioral problems and the need for comprehensive mental health services in rural areas where such resources were often lacking. The systematic nature of Yang's crimes also provided valuable insights into the psychology of serial killers and the methods they used to avoid detection. The forensic techniques developed during the investigation of Yang's crimes contributed to significant advances in Chinese criminal investigation capabilities. The use of DNA analysis, behavioral profiling, and interprovincial coordination in the Yang case established precedents that would be applied to numerous subsequent investigations. The case demonstrated the value of modern scientific methods in solving complex criminal cases and justified increased investment in forensic laboratories and training programs. The victims of Yang Xinhai were ordinary people living quiet lives in rural communities where their families had resided for generations. They included farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and children who had no connection to Yang other than their misfortune to cross his path during his reign of terror. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but the destruction of entire family lines that had persisted for centuries, erasing generations of accumulated knowledge, traditions, and relationships. The families who survived Yang's attacks or lost relatives to his violence became advocates for improved rural safety and better support for crime victims. Their efforts led to the establishment of victim compensation programs and counseling services that had previously been unavailable in rural areas. They also worked to ensure that their loved ones were remembered as individuals with their own hopes and dreams, rather than simply as statistics in a criminal case. The case revealed significant problems with China's missing persons reporting system, as many of Yang's victims had not been reported missing for days or weeks after their deaths. The isolation of rural communities and the assumption that missing persons had simply traveled to find work in cities meant that many murders went undiscovered for extended periods, allowing Yang to continue killing without fear of immediate detection. This recognition led to reforms in missing persons procedures and improved communication between rural communities and law enforcement agencies. The investigation into Yang's background revealed a pattern of escalating violence and criminal behavior that had gone largely unaddressed by the Chinese criminal justice system. His early convictions for theft and sexual assault had resulted in minimal sentences that failed to address the underlying psychological problems driving his behavior. The case highlighted the need for better rehabilitation programs and mental health services within the criminal justice system to identify and treat potentially dangerous offenders before they escalate to murder. The economic impact of Yang's crimes extended beyond the immediate costs of investigation and prosecution to include the broader effects on rural communities and tourism. Many villages experienced population declines as residents moved to safer urban areas, while agricultural productivity suffered as farmers abandoned isolated properties that had become too dangerous to maintain. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors also created long-term healthcare costs that continued for years after Yang's execution. The technological limitations of early 2000s China meant that many investigative techniques that would be routine today were not available to the original investigators. Cell phone tracking, digital forensics, and advanced DNA analysis were either unavailable or extremely limited, forcing investigators to rely on traditional police work and witness testimony. Despite these limitations, the investigation demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated multi-jurisdictional efforts and the importance of sharing information between different law enforcement agencies. The international dimensions of Yang's case were limited compared to other serial killers, as his crimes were confined to rural areas within China and did not involve foreign victims or cross-border elements. However, the case attracted significant international attention from criminologists and law enforcement professionals interested in studying serial killer behavior in different cultural contexts. The systematic nature of Yang's crimes and his ability to avoid detection for years provided valuable comparative data for understanding how serial killers operate in different social and geographical environments. The legal proceedings against Yang were complicated by the scale of his crimes and the need to coordinate evidence from multiple provinces and crime scenes. The Chinese legal system had limited experience with cases of this magnitude, requiring the development of new procedures for handling complex multi-jurisdiction prosecutions. The case established important precedents for future serial killer prosecutions and demonstrated the importance of thorough preparation and coordination in capital cases. The media coverage of Yang's case was carefully controlled by Chinese authorities, who sought to balance public interest in the story with concerns about social stability and international reputation. The extensive nature of Yang's crimes made them impossible to conceal entirely, but authorities worked to minimize sensational coverage that might inspire copycat crimes or create public panic. The case became a model for how authoritarian governments could manage media coverage of high-profile criminal cases while still maintaining public awareness of law enforcement successes. Prison officials who dealt with Yang during his brief incarceration described him as manipulative but ultimately cooperative, apparently resigned to his fate and showing no interest in appealing his death sentence. His behavior in prison was consistent with his psychological profile as a psychopath who understood the consequences of his actions but felt no genuine remorse for the harm he had caused. He spent his final months writing what he claimed was a confession and explanation of his crimes, though this document was never made public. The execution of Yang Xinhai marked the end of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in modern Chinese history, but it also raised broader questions about the death penalty and its effectiveness as a deterrent to extreme violence. While Yang's crimes were clearly deserving of the ultimate punishment, some critics argued that his execution prevented further study of his psychological condition that might have provided insights useful for preventing similar crimes in the future. The debate over capital punishment in serial killer cases continues to influence criminal justice policy in China and other countries that retain the death penalty. The legacy of Yang Xinhai's crimes continues to influence Chinese society and law enforcement practices more than 2 decades after his capture. The case fundamentally changed how rural communities approach security and safety, leading to the adoption of protective measures that were previously considered unnecessary. The improved coordination between provincial police forces and enhanced forensic capabilities developed during the investigation continue to benefit criminal investigations throughout China. The story of Yang Xinhai, the monster killer, remains one of the most disturbing examples of serial murder in modern history, a case that exposed the vulnerability of traditional communities to modern predators and the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies in protecting dispersed rural populations. His systematic campaign of terror against innocent families shattered the peace of countless communities and forced a nation to confront the reality that evil could emerge from within its own society. The victims of Yang Xinhai are remembered not as mere statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by unimaginable violence their memory serving as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, justice, and the protection of the most vulnerable members of society. Story 3. Story 4, the Bikini Killer. The deadly trail of Charles Sobraj. The humid Bangkok air hung heavy over the bustling streets of Khao San Road in December 1975, where backpackers from around the world gathered in cheap hostels and smoky bars, sharing tales of adventure and seeking the next thrill in their Southeast Asian odyssey. Among them moved a man who seemed to embody everything these young travelers aspired to be: sophisticated, charming, well-dressed, and mysteriously wealthy. His name was Charles Sobraj, though he went by many aliases, and he possessed a talent that would make him one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century. Born Hachin Paunani Gurumukh Charles Sobraj on April 6, 1944, in Saigon, French Indochina, Charles was the product of a turbulent union between an Indian Sindhi father and a Vietnamese mother. His early life was marked by abandonment and instability, emotions that would later fuel a decades-long killing spree across the hippie trail of Asia. When his father left the family, his mother Tran Long Pun struggled to provide for young Charles, eventually marrying a French soldier named Alphonse Darrow, who gave the boy his surname for a time. The young Charles displayed early signs of the manipulative charm that would later prove so deadly. Even as a child in 1960s Paris, where his family had relocated, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to lie convincingly and manipulate situations to his advantage. His adoptive father noticed disturbing behavioral patterns. Charles would steal money from family members, tell elaborate lies about his activities, and show little remorse when confronted with his actions. These early warning signs went largely unaddressed, allowing dangerous tendencies to develop and strengthen. By his teenage years, Charles had already begun his criminal career with petty theft and fraud. His first arrest came at age 18 for burglary, but even then his charm worked in his favor. He convinced authorities that he was merely a misguided youth who could be reformed, earning himself a lenient sentence. This early success in manipulating the justice system would become a recurring theme throughout his criminal career, as Charles learned to exploit the sympathies and biases of those in positions of authority. In the early 1970s, Charles made his way to Asia, drawn by the region's relaxed attitude toward Western travelers and the opportunities it presented for someone with his particular skills. The hippie trail that stretched from Istanbul to Kathmandu was filled with young, naive travelers carrying significant amounts of cash and valuable items, making them perfect targets for a sophisticated predator. Charles quickly realized that these travelers, far from home and often under the influence of drugs or alcohol, were particularly vulnerable to manipulation. His modus operandi was refined through practice and observation. Charles would befriend travelers, often presenting himself as a gem dealer or businessman with connections throughout Asia. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of local customs, languages, and travel routes, making him an invaluable guide to newcomers. His appearance worked in his favor. Handsome, well-groomed, and expensively dressed, he stood out among the typically disheveled backpacker crowd. He would offer assistance with travel arrangements, invite new acquaintances to expensive dinners, and shower them with attention and gifts. The poisoning method that would become his signature likely developed from his early experiments in drugging victims for robbery. Charles discovered that certain combinations of sedatives and toxins could be administered without detection, allowing him to incapacitate victims before robbing them. Initially, these crimes may not have been intended as murders, but as Charles became more confident and the stakes grew higher, he began using lethal doses to eliminate witnesses and reduce the risk of identification. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1975, though investigators believe he may have killed earlier victims whose deaths were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Teresa Knowlton, a young American woman traveling through Thailand, became Charles's first definitively linked victim. She was found dead in her Bangkok hotel room, apparently having drowned in the bathtub while under the influence of drugs. The local police initially ruled it an accidental death, exactly as Charles had planned, but Teresa's death was no accident. Charles had befriended her days earlier, charming her with his knowledge of Thai culture and offering to show her the city's hidden gems. On the night of her death, he had invited her to his hotel room for drinks, where he administered a carefully calculated dose of sedatives. When Teresa became unconscious, Charles placed her in the bathtub and held her underwater until she drowned, staging the scene to look like an accidental drowning. The success of this first murder emboldened Charles, and he began targeting travelers with increasing frequency. His next victim was Vitaly Hakim, a Turkish man whose body was found on a beach near Pattaya. Hakim had been strangled, but the murder scene was carefully arranged to suggest a robbery gone wrong. Charles had spent weeks befriending Hakim, learning about his travel plans and financial situation before determining that he was carrying enough money and valuables to make the murder worthwhile. As Charles refined his techniques, he developed a network of accomplices who helped him identify and access potential victims. Marie-Andrée Leclerc, a French-Canadian woman who became infatuated with Charles, served as his primary accomplice for several years. She would befriend female travelers, gaining their trust before introducing them to Charles. A.J. Chowdhury, a young Indian man desperate for Charles's approval, helped identify male victims and assisted in disposing of bodies. The murders continued throughout 1975 and into 1976, with Charles leaving a trail of bodies across Thailand, Nepal, India, and Malaysia. Each killing was carefully planned and executed, with Charles studying his victims for weeks before striking. He would learn their routines, their travel plans, and their financial situations, waiting for the perfect opportunity to isolate them and administer his deadly cocktails. Stephanie Perry and Laurent Carriere, two young travelers who had been exploring Thailand together, became Charles's next victims in December 1975. He befriended the couple in Bangkok, offering to help them find cheaper accommodations and introducing them to local dealers who could provide high-quality gems at wholesale prices. The couple, eager to make money to fund their continued travels, accepted Charles's offer to accompany him to a gem market in a remote area outside the city. On the journey, Charles offered them drinks laced with poison, telling them it was a local beverage that would help prevent altitude sickness. Both Stephanie and Laurent became violently ill within hours, suffering from severe stomach pain, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. Charles watched coldly as they died in agony, then carefully searched their belongings for money and valuable items before disposing of their bodies in a remote jungle area where they would not be discovered for months. The murders of Cornelia Hemker and Henricus Bintanja in December 1975 marked a turning point in Charles's killing spree. The Dutch couple had been traveling through Thailand when they encountered Charles in a Bangkok jewelry shop. He convinced them that he could help them purchase valuable gems at below-market prices using his connections with local miners and dealers. The couple, both experienced travelers who thought they were too smart to be deceived, nevertheless fell for Charles's sophisticated con. Charles invited Cornelia and Henricus to join him for dinner at an upscale Bangkok restaurant, where he regaled them with stories of his business dealings and travels throughout Asia. During the meal, he excused himself to use the restroom, taking the opportunity to add poison to their drinks. The couple became ill shortly after finishing their meal, but Charles convinced them that they were suffering from food poisoning common among Western travelers in Thailand. He offered to help them recover by providing what he claimed were traditional Thai remedies, but which were actually additional doses of poison. Over the course of several hours, Cornelia and Henricus became increasingly ill, experiencing severe abdominal pain, difficulty breathing, and eventually losing consciousness. Charles watched them die, then carefully staged the scene to suggest they had succumbed to a sudden illness or food poisoning incident. The bodies of Cornelia and Henricus were discovered in their hotel room the following day, burned beyond recognition. Charles had used a technique he had perfected over previous murders, dousing the bodies with gasoline and setting them on fire to destroy evidence and make identification difficult. The intense heat of the fire obliterated fingerprints, dental records, and other identifying features, while also destroying traces of the poison Charles had used. Local authorities initially attributed the deaths to an electrical fire or accident, exactly as Charles had intended. However, the discovery of additional bodies and the emergence of a pattern began to draw attention from international law enforcement agencies. Interpol began tracking reports of suspicious tourist deaths across Southeast Asia, noting similarities in the methods used and the presence of a well-dressed, charming man who had befriended many of the victims before their deaths. Charles's confidence in his abilities led him to take increasingly bold risks. In January 1976, he murdered Charmaine Carew, a young French woman who had been traveling alone through India. Charmaine had met Charles in New Delhi, where he introduced himself as a successful businessman with connections throughout Asia. He offered to help her navigate the complex process of obtaining travel permits for restricted areas of India, claiming that his government contacts could expedite the normally lengthy bureaucratic procedures. Charmaine, eager to visit remote regions that were typically off-limits to tourists, accepted Charles's offer of assistance. He took her to what he claimed was a government office, but was actually a private residence he had rented for the purpose of conducting his criminal activities. Once inside, Charles administered a fatal dose of poison disguised as tea, telling Charmaine it was a traditional Indian beverage that would help her adjust to the altitude and climate. As Charmaine died, Charles methodically searched through her belongings, taking her passport, money, and jewelry. He then transported her body to a remote area outside New Delhi, where he buried it in a shallow grave that would not be discovered for several months. When the body was eventually found, decomposition and animal activity had made identification nearly impossible, allowing Charles to avoid detection once again. The murder of Alan Aaron Jacobs in March 1976 demonstrated Charles's ability to adapt his methods to different situations and victims. Jacobs, an American student who had been traveling through Nepal, was more cautious than many of Charles's previous victims. He had heard warnings about travelers being robbed or worse, and he was careful about accepting invitations from strangers or consuming food and drinks that had been out of his sight. Charles recognized that his usual approach would not work with Jacobs, so he developed a more elaborate scheme. He arranged for Marie-Andrée Leclerc to befriend Jacobs independently, presenting herself as a solo female traveler who was also concerned about safety while traveling alone. Over the course of several days, she gained Jacobs' trust, eventually introducing him to Charles as her traveling companion and protector. The introduction seemed natural and innocent, with Charles presenting himself as someone who was helping Marie-Andrée navigate the complexities of travel in Nepal. Jacobs, reassured by Marie-Andrée's apparent trust in Charles, gradually lowered his guard. When Charles eventually invited both of them to join him for dinner at a restaurant he claimed was owned by a friend, Jacobs accepted, believing he would be safe in Marie-Andrée's company. During the dinner, Charles excused himself to speak with the restaurant owner, whom he claimed was an old friend from his business dealings in the region. In reality, he used this opportunity to add poison to Jacobs' drink, returning to the table with stories about the owner's hospitality and insistence that they try a special local liqueur. Jacobs, not wanting to offend their host's supposed generosity, consumed the poisoned drink despite his usual caution. Within hours, Jacobs became violently ill, experiencing symptoms that Charles attributed to altitude sickness common among travelers new to Nepal's high elevations. He offered to help Jacobs recover by providing what he claimed were traditional Nepalese remedies, but which were actually additional doses of poison designed to ensure the victim's death. Jacobs died in his hotel room that night, with Charles and Marie-Andrée claiming they had tried unsuccessfully to help him recover from his sudden illness. By mid-1976, Charles had killed at least 12 people, though investigators believe the actual number may have been significantly higher. His success in avoiding detection had made him increasingly bold and careless, leading to mistakes that would eventually expose his criminal activities. The turning point came in July 1976, when Charles attempted to poison a group of French tourists in New Delhi, but miscalculated the dosage, causing them to become ill without dying. The incident occurred at a hotel restaurant where Charles had befriended a group of French engineering students who were traveling through India during their summer vacation. He had spent several days gaining their trust, presenting himself as a successful businessman who could help them navigate India's complex bureaucracy and obtain permits for restricted areas they wanted to visit. The students, impressed by Charles's apparent wealth and knowledge, accepted his offer to treat them to dinner at an upscale restaurant. During the meal, Charles excused himself multiple times, claiming he needed to make phone calls related to his business dealings. In reality, he was adding poison to the students' drinks, but he miscalculated the dosage needed for the larger group. When the students became ill but did not die, they were taken to a local hospital where doctors became suspicious of the sudden onset of symptoms across multiple patients who had eaten together. Hospital staff contacted local police, who began investigating the incident as a possible poisoning case. When investigators interviewed the students about their activities before becoming ill, they consistently mentioned the charming businessman who had invited them to dinner. Hotel staff were able to provide a description of Charles and confirm that he had been seen with the victims on multiple occasions before their illness. The investigation expanded rapidly as police realized they might be dealing with a serial poisoner who had been targeting tourists throughout the region. Interpol was contacted, and investigators began comparing notes about suspicious tourist deaths across Southeast Asia. A pattern emerged linking multiple deaths to a well-dressed, charming man who befriended victims before their deaths, leading to the issuance of an international arrest warrant for Charles Sobraj. Charles learned of the police investigation through his network of contacts in the tourist industry, prompting him to flee India for Thailand. However, his years of successful murders had made him overconfident, and he believed he could continue his criminal activities by simply changing locations and identities. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation, as international law enforcement agencies were now actively coordinating their efforts to track him down. In Thailand, Charles attempted to resume his killing spree, but increased police awareness and media coverage of tourist deaths had made potential victims more cautious. Hotel staff and restaurant workers had been alerted to watch for suspicious individuals who seemed to be targeting Western travelers, making it much more difficult for Charles to operate without detection. Despite these challenges, he managed to kill at least 2 more people before finally being apprehended. His last confirmed victim was Dominique Renelot, a young French traveler who had been exploring Thailand's northern provinces. Charles encountered Renelot in Chiang Mai, where he was staying at a budget guest house popular with backpackers. Using his refined techniques, Charles befriended Renelot over the course of several days, learning about his travel plans and financial situation before determining that he was carrying enough money to make murder worthwhile. Charles invited Renelot to join him for a farewell dinner before the young Frenchman continued his journey north toward the Burmese border. During the meal, Charles administered what he intended to be a fatal dose of poison, but Renelot's body proved more resistant than previous victims. Instead of dying quickly, Renelot became violently ill and managed to alert other hotel guests before losing consciousness. Thai police were called to investigate what initially appeared to be a case of severe food poisoning, but the responding officers had been briefed about the international search for Charles Sobraj. When they interviewed hotel staff and other guests about Renelot's activities before becoming ill, the description of his dinner companion matched the profile they had been given of the suspected serial killer. The investigation moved quickly, with police reviewing hotel registration records and interviewing witnesses who had seen Charles in the area. His photograph was distributed to airports, border crossings, and transportation hubs throughout the region, making it nearly impossible for him to leave the country undetected. Within days, Thai authorities had identified his current alias and location, leading to his arrest at a Bangkok hotel in July 1976. Charles's arrest marked the end of a killing spree that had lasted more than 2 years and claimed at least 14 lives, though investigators believe the actual number of victims may have been much higher. Many suspicious tourist deaths throughout the 1970s were initially attributed to natural causes, accidents, or drug overdoses, making it difficult to determine the full extent of Charles's criminal activities. Some estimates suggest he may have killed as many as 20 people during his years operating along the hippie trail. The investigation that followed Charles's arrest revealed the sophisticated nature of his criminal operation. Police discovered that he had used more than 40 different aliases during his killing spree, complete with forged passports and identification documents that allowed him to move freely between countries. He had established safe houses and supply caches throughout Southeast Asia, storing poison, false documents, and stolen valuables that he could access when needed. Marie-André Leclerc and Ajay Chowdhury were arrested as accomplices, with investigators determining that they had played crucial roles in identifying and accessing victims. Leclerc had used her ability to befriend female travelers to gain their trust before introducing them to Charles, while Chowdhury had helped dispose of bodies and create false alibis for the murders. Both accomplices provided detailed confessions that helped investigators understand the full scope of Charles's criminal activities. The trial that followed was complicated by jurisdictional issues, as Charles's crimes had been committed across multiple countries with different legal systems. Thai authorities ultimately prosecuted him for the murders committed within their territory, while other countries filed separate charges for crimes committed within their jurisdictions. The complexity of the case and Charles's skill at manipulating legal proceedings meant that the trial process would continue for several years. Charles's behavior during his trial demonstrated the same charm and manipulation skills that had made him such an effective killer. He presented himself as a victim of circumstance, claiming that he had been trying to help tourists who had fallen ill from natural causes. He suggested that his presence at multiple death scenes was merely coincidental, arguing that as someone who frequented tourist areas and spoke multiple languages, he was often called upon to assist Western travelers who found themselves in difficulty. Despite Charles's attempts to manipulate the legal proceedings, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis of the victim's remains revealed traces of the poisons he had used, while witness testimony placed him with multiple victims shortly before their deaths. The discovery of stolen passports and personal items belonging to the victims in Charles's possession provided additional proof of his guilt. In August 1976, Charles Sobhraj was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment in Thailand. However, his story was far from over, as he would spend the next several decades attempting to escape from prison, manipulating legal systems, and continuing to charm and deceive those around him. His ability to maintain his innocence and convince others of his persecution became legendary among criminal justice professionals who encountered him. The case of Charles Sobhraj, the bikini killer, remains one of the most studied examples of international serial murder. His ability to operate across multiple countries and legal jurisdictions highlighted weaknesses in international law enforcement cooperation that have since been addressed through improved information sharing and coordination protocols. The sophistication of his methods and his psychological manipulation of victims provided valuable insights into the minds of serial killers that continue to inform criminal profiling and investigation techniques today. The victims of Charles Sobhraj were young people in the prime of their lives, seeking adventure and cultural experiences far from home. Their deaths cut short promising futures and left families around the world devastated by their loss. Teresa Knowlton had been a promising art student planning to teach in developing countries after her travels. Vitaly Hakim was studying international relations and hoped to work in diplomacy. Stephanie Perry and Laurent Carrière were engaged to be married after their return from Asia. Each victim represented not just a life lost, but dreams unfulfilled and potential unrealized. The impact of Charles's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to affect the entire backpacker culture of the 1970s. The freedom and trust that had characterized travel along the hippie trail was replaced by suspicion and caution, as travelers became aware that predators could lurk among the community of adventurers they had thought was safe. The romantic notion of wandering freely through exotic cultures was tempered by the harsh reality that such freedom came with significant risks. Law enforcement agencies throughout Asia were forced to confront the reality that their systems were ill-equipped to handle sophisticated international criminals who could exploit jurisdictional boundaries and cultural differences to avoid detection. The Charles Sobhraj case became a catalyst for improved cooperation between countries and the development of better protocols for tracking suspects across international borders. Interpol expanded its role in coordinating investigations and sharing information about suspected criminals operating in multiple countries. The psychological profile that emerged from studying Charles Sobhraj revealed a complex individual who combined exceptional intelligence and charm with complete lack of empathy for his victims. Mental health professionals who evaluated him identified characteristics consistent with psychopathy, including superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, and lack of remorse for his actions. His ability to maintain relationships with accomplices while manipulating and murdering strangers demonstrated the compartmentalized thinking common among serial killers. Charles's childhood experiences of abandonment and instability likely contributed to his development into a killer, though many people with similar backgrounds do not become criminals. The combination of his natural intelligence, early exposure to criminal behavior, and lack of consistent moral guidance created conditions that allowed his dangerous tendencies to develop unchecked. His success in early criminal activities reinforced his belief that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, leading to increasingly bold and violent crimes. The investigation into Charles's crimes also revealed the vulnerability of young travelers who were far from home and unfamiliar with local dangers. Many of his victims had been traveling alone or in small groups, making them easy targets for someone with Charles's predatory instincts. The informal communication networks that backpackers relied on for information about safe places to stay and travel routes could be easily infiltrated by someone intent on causing harm. The media coverage of Charles Sobrage's crimes fascinated the public and spawned numerous books, documentaries, and films exploring his story. The contrast between his charming exterior and murderous activities captured the imagination of writers and filmmakers who saw in him the perfect example of evil hiding behind an attractive facade. However, this media attention also had the unfortunate effect of romanticizing his crimes and turning him into a celebrity criminal whose notoriety far exceeded that of his victims. Charles himself became adept at manipulating media attention to his advantage, granting interviews and cooperating with authors and filmmakers who portrayed him in ways that enhanced his reputation as a sophisticated international criminal. He seemed to enjoy the attention and recognition that his crimes had brought him, displaying the narcissistic tendencies common among serial killers who crave recognition for their perceived superiority and cleverness. The legal proceedings against Charles continued for many years, complicated by the international nature of his crimes and his skill at exploiting legal technicalities. He successfully appealed several convictions, arguing that evidence had been improperly obtained or that his rights had been violated during arrest and interrogation. His ability to manipulate legal systems demonstrated the same skills that had made him such an effective killer, as he studied laws and procedures with the same intensity he had once applied to selecting and stalking victims. During his years in prison, Charles continued to maintain his innocence while simultaneously working to escape or reduce his sentences. He managed to escape from prison on multiple occasions, using his charm to convince guards and officials to relax security measures around him. Each escape attempt generated massive international attention and reinforced his reputation as a master manipulator who could not be contained by conventional security measures. The investigation into Charles's crimes also led to the discovery of a broader network of criminals who had been operating along the hippie trail, preying on vulnerable travelers. While Charles was the most prolific and sophisticated of these predators, he was not unique in recognizing the opportunities presented by young people traveling far from home with limited resources and support systems. The exposure of this criminal network led to increased security measures at popular backpacker destinations and better coordination between tourist industry professionals and law enforcement agencies. The families of Charles's victims struggled for decades to find closure and justice for their loved ones. The international nature of the crimes and the complexity of the legal proceedings meant that many families faced years of uncertainty about whether their loved one's killer would ever be held accountable. The media attention surrounding Charles often overshadowed the victims themselves, turning their deaths into entertainment rather than tragedies that deserve respect and remembrance. Support groups formed among the families of victims, providing emotional support and advocacy for improved international cooperation in criminal cases. These families became powerful advocates for changes in how international crimes are investigated and prosecuted, working to ensure that future victims would receive better justice than their loved ones had. Their efforts contributed to significant improvements in international law enforcement cooperation and victim support services. The case of Charles Sobrage also highlighted cultural and linguistic barriers that could be exploited by sophisticated criminals. His ability to speak multiple languages and understand cultural nuances in different countries allowed him to blend in with local populations and avoid detection by authorities who might not recognize suspicious behavior that would be obvious to someone from the victim's home culture. This recognition led to improved cultural training for law enforcement officers and better coordination between agencies from different countries. The forensic techniques used to investigate Charles's crimes were relatively primitive by today's standards, relying primarily on witness testimony, physical evidence, and circumstantial connections between the suspect and victims. The development of DNA analysis, improved toxicology testing, and digital forensics in subsequent decades has made it much more difficult for criminals like Charles to operate without leaving detectable evidence. However, his case demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation techniques and international cooperation that remain relevant today. The psychological impact of Charles's crimes extended to the law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and legal officials who worked on his case. Many reported being disturbed by his complete lack of remorse and his ability to discuss his crimes in clinical, detached terms. His charm and intelligence made it difficult for some professionals to maintain appropriate boundaries, leading to concerns about the potential for manipulation even within the criminal justice system. The study of Charles Sobrage's crimes contributed significantly to the development of criminal profiling techniques used to identify and capture serial killers. His methodical approach to selecting victims, sophisticated murder techniques, and ability to avoid detection provided valuable insights into how organized serial killers operate. These insights have been used to train law enforcement officers and develop investigative protocols that have helped solve numerous other serial murder cases. The international nature of Charles's crimes also raised important questions about jurisdiction and sovereignty in criminal cases. The fact that he could commit murders in one country and flee to another, where he might not be extradited, highlighted weaknesses in international legal cooperation that have since been addressed through improved extradition treaties and mutual legal assistance agreements. However, these improvements came too late to help many of Charles's victims receive the justice they deserved. Today, Charles Sobrage remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. His story continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and the general public who struggle to understand how someone could commit such heinous crimes while maintaining such a charming and personable exterior. His case serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most attractive and sophisticated facades, and that vigilance and skepticism are necessary tools for protecting ourselves and others from those who would do us harm. The legacy of the Bikini Killer extends far beyond his individual crimes to encompass broader lessons about international cooperation, criminal investigation techniques, and the vulnerability of travelers in foreign countries. While the improvements in law enforcement and security that resulted from his case have undoubtedly prevented other similar crimes, the memory of his victims serves as a continuing reminder of the human cost of evil and the importance of never forgetting those whose lives were cut short by his actions. The story of Charles Sobrage represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of international travel, when the promise of adventure and cultural exchange was corrupted by predators who saw opportunity in the vulnerability of young explorers. His crimes marked the end of an era of innocence for backpacker culture and forced a recognition that the world could be far more dangerous than many travelers had realized. The victims of the Bikini Killer paid the ultimate price for this harsh lesson, their deaths serving as a warning that continues to resonate with travelers and law enforcement agencies around the world today. And so we close another chapter in the shadows of true crime. If you're still listening, thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkness. The story of the giggling granny reminds us that truth can be stranger and more unsettling than fiction, hidden behind the most innocent of faces. Rest easy knowing that justice was served and that these stories from the past help us better understand the complexities of human nature. Sweet dreams, and remember, even in the darkest tales, there's always a light that eventually exposes the truth. Until next time, sleep well.